Pam Bondi walked into the chamber that day with one goal: expose the corruption that Washington's elite thought they had buried. They had underestimated her. They thought she would play by their rules. But then everything flipped in a way no one saw coming. Now picture this. The grand chamber of Congress was electric. The cameras were rolling, the lights blazed overhead, and every seat was filled with lawmakers, journalists, and staffers eager for a spectacle. At the center of it all stood Pam Bondi, the newly appointed U.S. Attorney General, a woman known for her razor-sharp legal mind and relentless pursuit of justice. Across from her, Schiff sat poised, exuding an air of smug confidence, believing he was about to dominate yet another political skirmish. But today, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken realization among the audience that this wasn't just another hearing, it was a reckoning. Pam Bondi took a slow step toward the microphone, adjusted her notes, and locked eyes with Schiff. She could see the subtle twitch in his jaw, the way he gripped the edge of the table just a little too tightly. He was prepared for a debate, but he wasn't prepared for her. She was about to dismantle his carefully crafted narrative piece by piece, and he knew it. "Honorable senators," she began, her voice steady and unwavering, "just to fact-correct a few things." Her words sliced through the room like a scalpel. There was no grandstanding, no dramatics, just cold, hard precision. The entire chamber leaned in slightly, as if drawn toward the gravitational pull of the moment. Bondi didn't waste a second. She went straight for the throat. Mr. Duffy didn't come from a state job. Mr. Duffy came from Deputy Chief of Staff at the Department of Defense before he went to the Office of Management and Budget. That's a big difference. Her eyes flickered toward Schiff, whose usual self-assurance seemed to falter for just a split second. She wasn't just correcting facts. She was exposing his strategy, the deliberate distortions, the omissions, the half-truths. And this was just the beginning. The House managers have stood here all day, telling you that the White House is hiding evidence, that we want to bury the truth. But let's talk about what they did. She paused, allowing the words to sink in. They started their proceedings in a secret bunker, without the president, without his legal counsel. They denied Ranking Member Nunes the right to call witnesses. They denied Ranking Member Collins the same. They call this fairness? They call this justice? A murmur rippled through the audience. Schiff shifted uncomfortably. Bondi had not only flipped the narrative, but she had done so with the icy precision of a seasoned prosecutor dismantling a witness on the stand. This was the moment everyone in the room realized. The game had changed. Schiff had walked in expecting to control the conversation. Instead, he found himself on trial, and Pam Bondi wasn't finished yet. Schiff shifted in his chair, his fingers drumming anxiously on the desk before him. The confidence he had walked in with was beginning to wane, and Pam Bondi saw it. She had cracked the armor of one of Washington's most seasoned manipulators, and now she was ready to drive the blade in deeper. The room, once buzzing with whispers and anticipation, had fallen into an uneasy silence. The House managers have spent the entire day telling you that the White House is hiding evidence. Bondi continued, her voice measured, unwavering. They claim we want to bury the truth. But let's talk about what they did. She leaned forward slightly, letting the weight of her words settle over the chamber. Across the room, a few senators exchanged glances. They knew where she was going with this. The closed-door hearings, the selective leaks, the calculated exclusion of witnesses who could have told a different story. Bondi was about to drag it all into the light. They started this process in a secret bunker, behind closed doors, refusing to allow the president or his legal counsel to participate, she said, her voice cutting through the stillness like a scalpel. They denied Ranking Member Nunes the right to call witnesses. They denied Ranking Member Collins the same. They held hearings in which only their chosen narrative was allowed to be heard. A murmur rippled through the audience. Schiff's fingers had stopped drumming. His usual composure, so carefully curated in front of cameras, was beginning to crack under the weight of Bondi's assault. She wasn't just arguing. She was building a case, piece by piece, laying out a pattern of deception that was impossible to ignore. She turned toward Schiff now, speaking directly to him. "You call this fairness? You call this justice?" The prosecutor in her voice rang clear. Schiff swallowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The silence in the room spoke for itself. The American people had been told that this impeachment process was about truth, about transparency. But Bondi was making it painfully clear. It had never been about that. This was about power, about control, about a carefully orchestrated effort to remove a sitting president by any means necessary. And Schiff? He wasn't a seeker of justice. He was an architect of corruption, a man who had stacked the deck and pretended it was a fair game. Bondi straightened, her expression unreadable. The House took no action on the subpoenas issued to Mr. Duffy and Mr. Blair. She continued, why? Because they didn't want a court to tell them that they were trampling on constitutional rights. They didn't want a ruling that exposed what this entire process has been from the start. A sham. The word hung in the air like a live wire. Schiff's jaw tensed, his grip tightening around his pen. He had walked into this hearing expecting to set the terms of engagement. But Pam Bondi had just rewritten the rules, and she wasn't done yet. Schiff inhaled sharply, forcing himself to maintain his composure. But Pam Bondi had him cornered. She could see it in his posture, the way his shoulders stiffened, the way he clutched his pen a little too tightly. He had spent years controlling narratives, bending facts to fit his agenda. But now, under the piercing scrutiny of Bondi, his house of cards was beginning to tremble, and she was just getting started. Let's shift the focus for a moment, Bondi said, her tone deceptively calm. The House managers claimed they were pursuing justice, that this process was about accountability. But let's talk about who they refused to hold accountable. She let the words hang for a moment, scanning the room, letting the weight of the moment build. Schiff knew exactly where this was going, and for the first time that evening, he truly looked uncomfortable. Joe Biden, Bondi said, enunciating each syllable with the precision of a prosecutor delivering a damning indictment. The man they claim is untouchable. The man whose name, when spoken in this chamber, suddenly makes due process and oversight disappear. A few murmurs rippled through the audience, some leaning in, others shifting in their seats. They had heard the whispers, seen the reports, but no one had dared say it outright in this setting, until now. Did the House managers ask Joe Biden a single question about his involvement in his son's lucrative business dealings in Ukraine? Bondi's gaze locked onto Schiff. Did they even try? Silence. Schiff shifted again, glancing toward his Democratic colleagues, but there was no lifeline coming. No, they didn't. Bondi answered her own question, her voice gaining strength. Because they knew what they would find. They knew that Hunter Biden, who had no experience in energy, no experience in Ukraine, and no business being on the board of Burisma, was being paid $83,000 a month. A month! A few gasps broke out in the audience. Schiff's pen tapped rapidly against the desk now, a subtle but telling tick. Bondi pressed forward, her voice sharp, deliberate. And what was Joe Biden's response when asked about this? She glanced down at her notes, though she already knew the words by heart. I never spoke to my son about his overseas business dealings. She shook her head, then looked up, her expression unreadable. Except that wasn't true, was it? She let the question linger, then delivered the killing blow. Because Hunter Biden told the New Yorker that he did speak to his father about Burisma, she said, each word cutting through the silence like a knife. He said, and I quote, "Dad said, I hope you know what you're doing." The weight of the contradiction settled over the room like a thick fog. Schiff's face was unreadable now, but Bondi could see the wheels turning in his mind, searching for an exit that didn't exist. This was never about justice, Bondi continued, her voice unwavering. Because if it were, Joe Biden and Hunter Biden would have been questioned, their stories would have been scrutinized. Instead, the House managers shielded them, refused to even consider their involvement, all while claiming that they were pursuing the truth. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. You want to talk about conflicts of interest? You want to talk about corruption? She gestured around the room. It's right in front of us. And yet somehow we're not allowed to ask the questions that matter most. Schiff had finally stopped tapping his pen. His face had darkened slightly, but he remained silent. He knew that anything he said now would only make things worse. Bondi's voice softened, but the intensity remained. What's more dangerous to democracy, holding the powerful accountable, or pretending corruption doesn't exist when it benefits your side? The room was silent. Schiff refused to meet her gaze. But Bondi wasn't done yet. Not even close. Bondi paused, letting the silence settle over the chamber like a heavy fog. She had exposed the lie, laid bare the hypocrisy, and now the weight of the truth was pressing down on everyone in the room. But this wasn't just about contradiction. This was about evidence. Cold, hard, irrefutable evidence that the very people screaming about corruption had been covering up their own crimes all along. She took a step forward, her eyes sweeping across the chamber. You see, senators, this isn't just speculation. It's not a smear campaign. It's not some baseless conspiracy. She turned back to Schiff, her voice razor sharp. We don't need to rely on speculation because Joe Biden told us exactly what he did, in his own words. On camera, a flicker of tension crossed Schiff's face, but he quickly masked it. He knew what was coming. Everyone did. A large screen behind Bondi flickered to life, and suddenly there he was, Joe Biden standing on a stage, bragging about the very thing the media said never happened. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. Biden's voice echoed through the chamber, the recording playing in crystal clear quality. I looked at them and said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a gun, he got fired. The words landed like a bombshell. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Some senators exchanged stunned glances, while others shifted uncomfortably. Schiff remained rigid, his lips pressed into a thin line. Bondi let the clip play for a moment longer, then turned back to face the room. That was Joe Biden, she said evenly, bragging about leveraging $1 billion in U.S. taxpayer money to get a Ukrainian prosecutor fired. The same prosecutor who just so happened to be investigating Burisma. The company paying his son $83,000 a month. She let the facts speak for themselves. No spin, no media filter, just the truth, straight from Biden's own mouth. But I thought there was no conflict of interest, she continued, her tone dripping with incredulity. I thought there was no wrongdoing. I thought we were supposed to believe that Joe Biden, out of the kindness of his heart, was just ensuring Ukraine had the right prosecutor in place. The tension in the room was palpable now. Some of the Democratic senators looked uneasy. They knew this wasn't a good look, no matter how much the media tried to bury it. Schiff finally spoke, his voice carefully measured. That's taken out of context. Bondi didn't even flinch. She had been waiting for this weak rebuttal. Oh, context? She shot back, arching an eyebrow. What context would make it acceptable for a sitting vice president to withhold U.S. aid in exchange for the firing of a prosecutor investigating his son's employer? Please, enlighten us. Schiff's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. What could he say? The evidence was right there, undeniable, unspinnable. Bondi pressed forward. Let me remind you what the House managers said when they started this impeachment. They said the President of the United States should be removed from office for allegedly conditioning aid to Ukraine on an investigation. But what did Joe Biden do? She gestured toward the screen. He did exactly that. And not only did he do it, he was proud of it. The hypocrisy was suffocating. If Donald Trump had said those words, son of a gun, he got fired, we wouldn't be sitting here debating impeachment. He'd already be gone. A silence fell over the room once more. The weight of the moment was crushing. Schiff had walked into this hearing thinking he would be the one controlling the narrative. Instead, he was now the one under the microscope. Bondi took a breath, then delivered the final blow. So the question isn't whether there was a quid pro quo, she said, her voice cool and deliberate. The question is, why is it only considered a crime when Donald Trump is the one accused of doing it? She looked directly at Schiff now. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He had no answer. But Bondi wasn't done yet. Bondi stepped back slightly, giving the room a moment to absorb the undeniable reality she had just laid before them. Schiff sat frozen, his lips pressed together in a thin, pale line. But she could see the frustration burning behind his carefully controlled expression. He had spent months pushing the narrative that Trump had committed the crime of the century. But now, the entire chamber was staring at a video confession from Joe Biden himself. And suddenly, the story wasn't so clear-cut anymore. But Bondi wasn't here just to prove a point. She was here to expose how deep this deception ran. She took a slow breath, then looked out over the chamber. Now, some of you may be wondering, if this was out in the open, if Joe Biden stood on stage and said these words himself, why haven't you heard more about it? Why wasn't this the major story of the decade? Why weren't journalists scrambling to investigate, to uncover the full extent of what happened? She let the question hang for a moment, her eyes locking onto the journalists seated near the back of the chamber. We all know the answer, don't we? Her voice was sharp now, cutting through the silence like a blade. Because the people who were supposed to report the truth, the media, the so-called watchdogs of democracy, buried it. A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Some of the reporters in attendance stiffened, others looked away. Schiff shifted uncomfortably in his seat again. Bondi continued, her voice steady but forceful. When this impeachment process began, CNN, MSNBC, The Washington Post, they all ran wall-to-wall coverage, breathlessly pushing the claim that Donald Trump had engaged in quid pro quo. They demanded investigations, congressional hearings, emergency press conferences. She gestured toward the screen behind her, where Biden's smug expression was still frozen mid-sentence. Yet when this video surfaced, when the actual sitting vice president of the United States was caught admitting to the very thing they accused President Trump of doing, what did the media do? She paused, scanning the room. They called it a conspiracy. They said it was out of context. They dismissed it as right-wing misinformation. She turned back toward Schiff. And you let them do it. Schiff's mouth twitched, but he didn't interrupt. He knew better than to step into her trap. Bondi wasn't done. We don't have a free press in this country anymore, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. We have political operatives disguised as journalists. The same media that demanded investigations into Trump's so-called corruption refused to ask a single question about Biden's conflict of interest. They covered for him. They protected him. She turned toward the senators now. And make no mistake, this wasn't incompetence. It wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. The air in the chamber felt heavier now, thick with an unspoken tension. Bondi knew she was saying the very thing that millions of Americans already believed, that the media had become nothing more than a propaganda arm for the establishment. But no one in Washington had dared to say it so plainly, until now. She leaned forward slightly, her voice lower but no less intense. The same media that smeared every Trump supporter as racist and deplorable for asking basic questions about Hunter Biden's business deals. They weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in control. Schiff finally spoke, though his voice lacked its usual smugness. You're attacking the press because they reported facts you don't like. Bondi let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. Oh, Adam, she said almost pityingly. The problem isn't that they reported facts. The problem is that they decided which facts were worth reporting. Schiff had no response. Bondi turned back to the chamber, her expression unreadable. This impeachment isn't about justice. It never was. It's about who gets to control the narrative. And for the past 4 years, the media has done everything in their power to control it for you. She turned, locking eyes with Schiff again. But today, you don't get to control it anymore. Schiff was silent. The reporters in the back looked visibly uncomfortable. The American people had been gaslit for years, told that corruption wasn't corruption if it benefited the right people. But Pam Bondi had just ripped that illusion apart, and she was just getting started. Bondi took a step back, letting her words settle over the chamber like a thundercloud. The weight of the truth she had just unleashed was suffocating. Schiff's carefully constructed illusion, the one upheld by media allies and Washington insiders, was shattering before his eyes. But Bondi wasn't here just to expose the media's complicity. She was about to unveil something even darker. She turned toward the senators, her tone shifting, now razor-sharp with precision. But this isn't just about a single cover-up, she said. It's not just about one scandal, one video, one lapse in journalistic integrity. She let the words sink in before delivering the gut punch. This is about an entire network of corruption, one that starts at the very top. A hush fell over the room. Some senators stiffened in their seats. Schiff's grip tightened on his pen again, but Bondi saw something new in his face. Panic. The media buried Biden's quid pro quo because it wasn't just about protecting him, she continued. It was about protecting all of them. She gestured around the chamber, her eyes scanning the faces of those who had spent years pretending none of this was happening. Because if they allowed the American people to look too closely at Joe Biden, they might start asking what else was hiding beneath the surface. She let that question linger before answering it herself. And they would have found that this isn't just about Joe Biden and Ukraine. It's about an entire family that has spent decades selling out America for their own financial gain. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Schiff was shifting uncomfortably again, and Bondi knew why. The truth was radioactive. She pressed forward. Joe Biden didn't just protect his son's dirty deals with Burisma. He protected his entire family's corruption operation. A few senators exchanged glances. Bondi continued, her voice unwavering. You see, while Joe Biden was leveraging his political power to fire a prosecutor investigating his son, other members of the Biden family were raking in millions from foreign interests. She lifted a document from her folder, holding it up for all to see. In 2017, Hunter Biden's company received a $3.5 million wire transfer from Elena Baturina, a Russian oligarch. She let that settle before adding, and this was while Joe Biden was vice president. A wave of whispers swept through the room. Then there's China. She placed the document down and reached for another. Hunter Biden, through his firm, also received millions from a company directly linked to the Chinese Communist Party. Bondi glanced toward Schiff, but he wouldn't meet her gaze. And where was the media then? She asked, her voice dripping with the weight of the answer. Where were the front-page stories? Where were the prime-time specials? Silence. She leaned forward slightly. The House managers would have you believe that Donald Trump is the greatest threat to democracy, that we must remove him from office for daring to ask about corruption. But what they won't tell you is this. Joe Biden didn't just enable corruption, he profited from it. She turned back to the senators. And let me ask you this. Why do you think days before leaving office, Biden issued pardons to his closest allies? A few heads snapped up. Even some Democratic senators looked uneasy now. Oh yes, Bondi continued, her voice now laced with steel. While the media was telling you that Donald Trump was a criminal, Joe Biden was issuing last-minute pardons to protect his own people, ensuring that if justice ever came knocking, it wouldn't touch them. Schiff exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head slightly. Bondi turned back to him. You look uncomfortable, Mr. Schiff, she said smoothly. You should be, because we are no longer asking whether there was corruption. She tapped the documents in front of her. We're showing you the proof. A heavy silence fell over the chamber. Schiff's smug confidence had long since evaporated. He had walked into this hearing believing he would dictate the terms, control the flow of information. Instead, he had just watched Pam Bondi lay out a case that even he couldn't argue against, and she wasn't finished yet. Bondi let the weight of her words settle, her gaze locked on Schiff, who now sat motionless, his hands clasped together, his knuckles turning white. She could see it, the realization creeping into his eyes. The game had changed. The carefully orchestrated assault on President Trump had backfired spectacularly. But Bondi wasn't here to savor the moment. She was here to drive the truth home, to ensure that Washington's corrupt establishment would never recover from this reckoning. She stepped forward, her voice unwavering. Now let's talk about why this corruption was allowed to fester. She gestured around the chamber, her expression hardening. Because for years, Washington has been run by career politicians who see public office not as a duty, but as a business. A business where power is traded like currency and loyalty is bought with backroom deals. She turned to Schiff now, her tone icy. And you, Mr. Schiff, are one of the worst offenders. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Schiff's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. For years, you've paraded yourself as a defender of democracy, Bondi continued. You claimed to fight against corruption, yet you turned a blind eye when it was your own party orchestrating the schemes. You smeared President Trump for daring to ask about Biden's ties to Ukraine, but you knew the truth all along. She leaned forward slightly. Didn't you? Schiff blinked but remained silent. Bondi gave a knowing smile. Oh, you did. You just didn't expect anyone to have the courage to say it out loud. She turned back to the senators. And let's be clear, this isn't just about Schiff. This is about an entire system that protects its own. She lifted another document from her folder, her voice sharp as a blade. When President Trump took office, he did something Washington insiders never expected. He started exposing them. She paused, scanning the room. And that's why they hate him. She continued. They spent 4 years trying to destroy him. Not because he was corrupt, but because he wasn't. Not because he was a threat to democracy, but because he was a threat to their power. Bondi's voice grew more forceful. The first time around, Trump made one mistake. He trusted the wrong people. He filled his cabinet with establishment figures, people like John Bolton, Rex Tillerson, and yes, even Mike Pence. People who whispered in his ear, telling him to play by Washington's rules. She shook her head. But that Trump is gone, and they know it. She took another step forward, her voice unwavering. The Trump of 2024 is different. He has learned. He has seen firsthand just how deep the corruption runs. And this time, he's only surrounding himself with people who are truly committed to draining the swamp. She let that statement settle before delivering the knockout punch. And that's why they are terrified. The silence in the chamber was deafening. Schiff's usual arrogance had completely evaporated. He wasn't in control anymore. Bondi exhaled, shaking her head slightly. You see, Mr. Schiff, you and your allies in the media thought you could manipulate the American people. You thought you could use impeachment, endless investigations, and manufactured scandals to make them turn against Trump. She smiled. But all you did was prove him right. Another murmur spread through the chamber, louder this time. Schiff's face darkened, but he still said nothing. Bondi turned back to the senators. The American people have had enough. Enough of the lies. Enough of the cover-ups. Enough of politicians like Schiff who think they can lecture this country about democracy while using their power to silence dissent. She paused. And if you think for 1 second that Trump is coming back to play nice, think again. She stepped back, letting her final words hang in the air like a storm cloud. Because this time, he isn't playing by Washington's rules. The room was silent. Schiff had no words. The Senate chamber had just witnessed the political earthquake that Washington had feared all along, and Pam Bondi wasn't done yet. Pam Bondi let her words settle like a storm cloud over the chamber. The silence was deafening, the weight of the truth pressing down on every person in the room. Schiff had walked into this hearing thinking he would control the conversation, but Bondi had just shattered that illusion. She wasn't just exposing corruption, she was exposing the system itself. She took a step forward, her voice unwavering. This isn't about partisanship. It's not about Republicans or Democrats. This is about who holds the power in this country and who they answer to. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Bondi had just cut through the noise, getting to the heart of the issue. For years, the American people have been told what to believe, she continued. They've been told that if they question authority, they're extremists. If they demand accountability, they're a threat to democracy. If they don't conform, they'll be silenced. She turned toward Schiff now, her tone razor sharp. And who is deciding what's acceptable? Who is pulling the strings? Schiff swallowed but didn't answer. He knew where she was going. The media, big tech, the intelligence agencies, they've all worked together to control not just what the American people see, but what they're allowed to say. Bondi gestured toward the journalists seated in the back. They told you the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation. That was a lie. They told you there was no Biden corruption in Ukraine. That was a lie. They told you Trump colluded with Russia. That was a lie. Her voice grew sharper. And yet, every single time these lies were exposed, no one was held accountable. Schiff shifted in his seat, gripping his pen tightly. Bondi saw the tension in his jaw, the way he avoided looking in her direction. He knew she was right. She continued, her voice cutting through the silence. This was never about Trump. He was just the one man they couldn't control, the one man who refused to play their game, and that terrified them. She took another step forward, her final words laced with quiet intensity. But here's the thing about the American people, Mr. Schiff. You can try to silence them. You can try to bury the truth. But you can't make them forget what they've seen. A charged silence filled the chamber. Schiff sat motionless, his carefully crafted narrative crumbling around him. Pam Bondi had just ripped Washington's biggest secret into the open, and the American people were watching. Pam Bondi took a slow breath, letting the weight of her words linger in the chamber. The silence was thick, charged with unspoken tension. Schiff had spent years bending narratives, twisting the truth, and manipulating the media to suit his agenda. But now, with every passing moment, it was becoming clear. His game was over. She turned toward the senators, her expression unreadable. "But this fight isn't just about what's happened in the past," she said, her voice calm but deliberate. "It's about what happens next." She let that hang in the air for a moment before delivering the hammer blow. November 8th. The mere mention of the date sent a ripple through the chamber. Some senators leaned forward slightly, others stiffened in their seats. Schiff's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "That's the day when the American people get to decide whether they still have a voice," Bondi continued. "That's the day when they get to choose whether Washington belongs to the people or to the corrupt politicians who have spent decades selling them out." She let the words sink in before pressing forward. "For the last 4 years, they've tried everything to stop President Trump. They impeached him, they censored him, they raided his home. And why?" She turned toward Schiff now, her eyes locked onto him. "Because they're terrified of what happens when the American people choose him again." Schiff exhaled sharply, but he still didn't speak. He didn't need to. Bondi had stripped away every pretense, every talking point. The reality was right in front of him. "They say this election is about saving democracy," Bondi continued. "But democracy isn't about who can shout the loudest on CNN. It isn't about who can control the headlines or manipulate social media. It's about the American people choosing their future." She let her gaze sweep across the room. "And no matter how hard you try, no matter how many investigations, no matter how many lies you tell, you can't stop them." The silence that followed was deafening. Schiff's fingers twitched against the desk, his entire demeanor that of a man who had lost control of the narrative. Bondi leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "On November 8th, the American people won't just be voting for a president. They'll be voting for justice, for truth, for a country that belongs to them again." She stepped back, her final words cutting through the tension like a blade. "And when that day comes, no amount of lies will save you." Schiff didn't move. He didn't speak, because he knew his time was running out. Bondi let her final words settle, the weight of them pressing down on the chamber like an approaching storm. Schiff sat motionless, his carefully rehearsed defenses shattered. The entire room had felt it. The shift, the undeniable moment where the truth cut through the noise, the deception, the distractions. There was nothing left for him to hide behind. The American people had seen too much. She took a step back, her expression unreadable. "But make no mistake," she said, her voice low, steady, the calm before the reckoning. "This fight isn't over." She turned toward the cameras now, toward the millions of Americans watching at home. "They will try again. They will use everything in their power to keep control. The media will lie. Big tech will censor. The politicians in Washington will do whatever it takes to make you believe that your voice doesn't matter." She let her gaze sweep across the room, pausing just briefly on Schiff before continuing. "But here's what they don't understand. The American people are not afraid anymore." A murmur rippled through the chamber. This wasn't just a hearing. This was something bigger. "They have called you extremists. They have called you threats to democracy. But let me tell you something." Bondi's voice hardened now, carrying with it a conviction that couldn't be ignored. "The real threat to democracy isn't the people demanding accountability. It's the ones trying to silence them." Schiff's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to interject, to push back, but there was nothing left to say. Bondi stepped forward. "So I have one last message to the American people," she said, her voice clear, unwavering. "Stand up, speak out, don't back down." She let those words settle, then delivered the final blow. Because this country belongs to you. For the first time since the hearing had begun, Schiff looked away. Pam Bondi had done more than dismantle his argument. She had exposed everything, and now all that was left was for the American people to take back what was theirs. Pam Bondi adjusted the microphone, then straightened her posture. The room was silent. Schiff wouldn't meet her gaze. The senators, the journalists, the staffers, they all felt it. Something had shifted. The narrative had collapsed. The American people had just witnessed a reckoning. She took one last look around the chamber, then turned to the cameras, speaking directly to the millions watching at home. What you saw here today wasn't just about one man or one party, she said, her voice steady, unwavering. It was about the truth they tried to bury, the truth they tried to silence. But here's the thing about the truth. It doesn't need their approval. It doesn't bend to their corruption. It doesn't disappear just because the media refuses to report it. She let those words settle before continuing. They thought they could manipulate you. They thought they could gaslight you into believing that justice only applies when it benefits them, that the rules only matter when they're being used against their enemies. She shook her head slightly. But you're smarter than that. You see what's happening. You've seen the lies. You've seen the double standard. And now the choice is in your hands. She paused, her expression resolute. This is your country, not theirs. Not the politicians who have spent decades selling it out. Not the media who tell you what you're allowed to think. Not the tech giants who decide who can and cannot speak. Her voice rose, her conviction cutting through the air. America belongs to you, and it's time to take it back. A murmur spread through the room. Schiff still hadn't spoken. He wouldn't, because he had lost. Bondi straightened her papers, then stepped back from the podium. To every American watching, she said, her voice now carrying the weight of finality, they want you to feel powerless. They want you to believe that you don't have a say, that Washington will always be controlled by the same corrupt politicians, that nothing will ever change. She took a breath. But they're wrong. She let her gaze linger on the camera. On November 8th, you get to decide. You get to send them a message they can't ignore. That this country is not for sale. That the truth still matters. That the American people will not be silenced. She let those words hang for a moment, then delivered her final call to action. If you believe in truth, if you believe in justice, if you believe that America is worth fighting for, stand up, speak out, and vote. She turned, walking away from the podium, the chamber still thick with the weight of everything she had just exposed. And that proved one thing. Sometimes the best way to defeat corruption is to drag it into the light. If you believe in fighting for truth, make sure to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe. Because this isn't just a story, it's a battle, and it's one we intend to win.